Welcome to CoMotion Lab's Fundamentals for Startups. I have a couple of announcements before we get to the main event. Next week, next Friday, Lakita Williams, who's the co-founder of Co-Create Work, a consultancy that helps small businesses, startups, and emerging companies build transformational culture through executive coaching, accelerated leadership development, and culture strategy, will present Building Your Culture as You Scale Your Business. All of our Fundamentals for Startups presentations are archived on our CoMotion website under labs/startup training videos. We have covered a variety of topics over the past several years, so if you find yourself with some free time on your hands these days, please check out our past talks. For our full schedule and to register for future fundamentals, please visit comotion.uw.edu/events. Today, JP Nichols is here to present Bankers Are from Mars, Fintechs Are from Venus, Lessons for All Entrepreneurs Working with Conservative Corporate Partners. JP Nichols has been internationally recognized as a leading voice for innovation, strategy, and leadership, and his work has been featured in top publications and conferences around the world. He is co-founder of Fintech Forge, the industry leader in helping enterprises build and leverage their innovation capacity through strategic partnerships and investments, and co-founder of the Alloy Labs Alliance, the world's first member-driven shared innovation lab and accelerator for regional and community banks. During the talk today, we will take all questions via chat, located at the bottom of your screen. And now I will turn the event over to JP. Thank you. Welcome.
Well, thanks. And thanks for having me. I spent 20 years helping to grow a small $6 billion bank into a global, mostly U.S. focused, $400 billion bank today that's known as U.S. Bank. And I really spent the last few years there, starting at the end of the last financial crisis, really thinking a lot about innovation. The banking industry hadn't been very innovative. And I started to look at the rise of technology and cloud and mobility and then things like blockchain and other new kinds of technology and this whole rise of what we call fintech, financial technology, and how it was impacting the banks and what that meant for them. So I've spent about the last 8 years kind of at the intersection of traditional financial services and fintech. I've advised a number of fintech companies, and we actually have the #1 global fintech radio show and podcast. It's called Breaking Banks. So if you like hearing about this stuff, look us up on your favorite podcast provider, and you'll hear me and Jason Hendricks and Brett King and lots of others talk a lot about these things. One of the things that we've done over about last year and a half is formed a consortium of banks that we call the Alloy Labs Alliance. It's about 40 banks today, totaling over $180 billion. So if we were combined into a single institution, we would actually be a top 25 bank. And it's really about bringing them all together to help them innovate faster. Sometimes that means partnering with fintechs or investing in fintechs. And sometimes it's doing things internally. And so what I want to do today is share a little bit of that insight with you from the bank's perspective. Some of you may be working in fintech already. And even if you're not, I think some of the lessons will be transferable anyway for anyone that's working with corporate partners in developing their own company. Because I think at the end of the day, one fundamental truth for startups is the race is, can you scale faster than the big incumbents can innovate, right? So if you might have the latest killer idea, but you've got to reach scale, they've got scale, but they maybe don't have the killer idea. So how does that race work? And in many cases, it means working together. And so this is a slide, and by the way, I teach at the Pacific Coast Graduate School of Banking at UW in the summers, and a couple of the other programs. And so some of what I'm going to share with you today is what I actually teach bankers about how to be innovative and how to act more like a startup. So I'm kind of putting the flip side on for you today, which is to give startups a little bit of an idea what your corporate partners are, how they're wired, and kind of the way that they work. And so I share this quote from Seth Godin that I think is a good one. The innovator shows up with something she knows might not work, and pause for a second and contrast that with everyone else who's been trained to show up with a proven, verified, approved, deniable answer that will get them an A on the test. I mean, this is kind of the corporate world, right? It's all about how do I get the A? But as Seth points out, if failure is not an option, then most of the time neither is success. It's pretty common for someone to claim that they're innovative when actually all they are is popular, profitable, or successful. Nothing wrong with that, but that's not innovative. And so I spend a lot of my time talking to banks that say, well, what we're doing right now actually works pretty well. Why should we be more innovative? And I'll talk about the reasons that they do need to innovate and some of the ways that we think that they can do that. But again, I think for you, it's the flip side of this is, you might have something that's innovative, but it might not be popular, profitable, or successful. And at the end of the day, if your startup's going to make it, you got to figure out a way to do both. So that means your innovation has to solve a problem that people care about. And so when you think about the way ideas come into the marketplace, Gartner gave us the hype curve in 1995, and it's a useful construct to think about this. So what happens is there's a new technology trigger. So whether that's some of the things I talked about already, like mobility or broadband or blockchain or whatever, this means something's capable or possible today that wasn't possible yesterday. And so what happens then is we reach the peak of inflated expectations. This is where we were maybe 2 years ago around Bitcoin and some of the cryptocurrencies. So, the whole financial system is going to collapse and everybody's just going to have a Bitcoin wallet and that's all that's going to matter. Then as some of those things fail to materialize, we end up in this trough of disillusionment. And some of those ideas then just die off from there. They didn't get market traction and they go away. But those that don't die end up coming up to what they call the slope of enlightenment and then eventually the plateau of productivity. And this is where things become mainstream. I love telling the story of Uber. I was a fairly early adopter of Uber. I was in San Francisco early on before it was very widely known. I think in about 2011, maybe it was the first time that I used them, and that is absolutely ubiquitous today. So I'll talk about them in a second as we talk about the flip side of this. So this is how ideas take place, but this crazy idea that you'd be able to pick up your phone, push a button, and a car would come find you and take you to wherever you wanted to go. And so you think, how do you navigate this as a company? In 1957, Everett Rogers thought about people who adopt new ideas. And at the time, he was just looking at hybrid seeds and he was looking at farmers. And he found that about 2.5% of people, or about 3 standard deviations out, are the innovators, the people that are actually testing and trying new ideas. The next standard deviation, about 13.5% of the population, are the early adopters. Those are the people, they may not have invented it, but they're going to test it early on. I was somewhat of an early adopter of Uber, as I mentioned. I was a late adopter to CDs because I already had cases full of cassette tapes that worked good enough. And I actually leapt over the CD revolution, and I was fairly early adopter into digital music. I was one of those people stealing music off of Napster back before we kind of realized maybe that wasn't the best idea either. And so, and I was now a late adopter to streaming music. I'm still learning all of my way around Spotify and all of that. So it's not that it's you as a person, hey, I'm an early adopter or I'm not an adopter. It's kind of situational, but this is what it looks like. But the fat part of the curve, 2/3 of us at any given kind of new idea are somewhere in the majority, early majority or late majority. And then for whatever reason out on the right end, Rogers didn't add, he didn't carry it out into 2 standard deviations. He just calls them all laggards. But I assure you it does exist. It's my mother-in-law. And I love joking about her, but this is a true story. She once told me, and this was a good 20 years ago now, she didn't like to go to the ATM because it took too long. I said, well, what do you mean it takes too long? She says, well, you can only take the money out in $10 increments. So you know what she was doing, right? She was putting in her card, taking out a $10 bill, getting her card and the receipt back, and doing that over 10 times if she wanted $100. So some of us are a little later than others. Now, I don't mean at all to overlay age on this. It's maybe somewhat correlated, but my mom, who was just a few years younger than my mother-in-law, my favorite text from her iPhone 7 was, do you know if Skype takes PayPal because I need a new headset? So it's not just an age thing, but some people adopt new ideas faster than others. In 1993, Jeffrey Moore wrote a really important book. And any of you that are running startups, I hope if you haven't, you'll run right out and buy Crossing the Chasm. And what Jeffrey pointed out was that this gap between the early adopters and the early majority is not just a gap or a line, it's a chasm. And if you can't cross that chasm, you're not going to be able to scale your company. Think of something like, I'm losing track of the name. What are those silly scooters that you ride on that the mall cops and those ride on? The Segway. Thank you. Do any of you have a Segway? Probably not, unless you're a mall cop. A great idea, amazing technology. If you think about the technology trigger, the gyroscopes and the balancing devices and the battery power and all that stuff was pretty amazing technology, but it didn't solve a big enough problem for a big enough market. So they weren't able to cross the chasm. Company didn't fail, they're still there, that they're much more of a niche market company. And when you put the two of these together, you can see how it kind of works, because ideas aren't, fundamentally good or bad. They either catch in the marketplace or they don't. And if they don't, it's often a problem of failing to cross the chasm. And so with that as a little bit of a background, let me talk a little bit about the banks, because, or again, even if you're not working in fintech, if you're working with any large corporate partners, the incumbents are mostly coming from right of the chasm. And what Jeffrey Moore wrote about in Crossing the Chasm, I think is important. It's to understand that people left of the chasm, those innovators and those early adopters, they're looking for a massive upside, be the first to do something, and maybe a game-changing or life-changing kind of new technology, or make $1 billion. But they're willing to take a fair amount of risk in order to pursue that upside. People right of the chasm are exactly the opposite. They're not looking for the upside. They're trying to protect the downside. They want to keep their job, hopefully get a bonus, maybe get a promotion, not have their boss mad at them. And in exchange for that, they don't really care so much about the upside. In fact, they're willing to accept a lower downside. This is where phrases like "nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM" come from. They like things that are tried and true and proven. So one of the things that you need to think about if you're going to be selling to a corporate partner is the first person you're going to talk to that's going to get you in the door is probably left of chasm. This might be somebody on the innovation team or R&D or corporate development, or just somebody who's wired a little bit different than most of the corporate drones. But at the end of the day, if you're going to get any kind of long-term funding or long-term partnership, you've got to be able to address the needs of the people right of the chasm. So let's talk about what that looks like for them. One of my favorite sayings is from Bill Gates, and he says that success is actually a poor teacher, because what got us to this stage is not necessarily what gets us to the next stage. And for banks, if you think about prior to the last financial crisis, they spent an entire generation, for the most part, with rising asset prices, falling interest rates, in an era of deregulation. And then suddenly, in this rise of what we ended up calling the global financial crisis, it brought all that to a screeching halt, but at the same time, the rise of those new technologies that I already talked about. And so that caused a major change for a lot of the banks, and the capabilities of what was possible suddenly had changed, while they were still focused on how do we solve that last problem. How do we serve the market that we already knew that hadn't changed for a generation? The second book on your list, if you haven't read this one already, is I hope you read The Innovator's Dilemma. Clayton Christensen, who just passed away earlier this year from the Harvard Business School. You'll notice the subtitle is When New Technologies Cause Great Firms to Fail. And I actually think about this a lot in the banking industry. I wrote over 7 years ago now, I wrote this in American Banker, that the banks are facing their own innovator's dilemma. And the dilemma is this. So right of chasm folks, right? The incumbents, the established corporations, the dilemma is that I have real life customers buying real life products, generating real life revenue. And if I'm doing it right, real life profit today, right now, why should I divert any of those limited and precious resources to something that may or may not pay off at some unknown rate at some unknown date in the future? Yet if I don't do that, I know I'm probably going to sink slowly into obscurity, maybe quickly into obscurity. And this is where the stories like Blockbuster and Kodak and others come into the popular jargon here. We talk about disruption. Well, in the industry, in the book, Christensen talks about the steel industry. And prior to the 1970s, there was exactly one way to make steel. It involved about $1 billion investment into an integrated steel manufacturing plant. The two kids in the garage weren't getting up in the morning and saying, hey, let's go disrupt the steel industry. But disruption did happen. There was new technology, a new technology trigger, a new process called mini mills. And it emerged from Asia. And mini mills could produce steel for 1/10 the cost of a traditional integrated steel manufacturer. The problem was, and the offset of this, the downside, was that they could only make one kind of steel. And that was rebar. That's the cheap crisscross metal bars that's embedded in the concrete beneath our feet and all of the bridges and commercial buildings, and maybe not in the homes where most of us are working today. But we all know about rebar. It's a fundamental piece of construction. So that was the lowest part of the food chain. The steel industry's reaction to mini mill technology creating rebar at 1/10 the cost was, they can have it. That was the lowest part of our food chain. It was the lowest margin. We'll actually move upscale into more profitable segments of the business. And the problem is, with a 90% cost advantage, the fintechs were able, or the mini mills in this case, were able to reinvest those excess profits into more R&D, and pretty soon they could do rods and bars and then structural steel. And then before you knew it, the only thing left was flat rolled steel. That was the top of the food chain. And in fact, Bethlehem Steel famously doubled down, got out of all steel production except for flat rolled steel. And that worked for about 18 months. I probably don't have to tell any of you the kind of pain that the steel industry went through, the bankruptcies, the layoffs, the restructuring. And now today, virtually all the steel in the world is made through a mini mill process. So it clearly was disruptive. And when I think about fintech, I think we're still at the rebar stage. So there's been a lot of little slices that have been taken off of the traditional incumbents' plates from little pieces of technology, and we'll talk about some of those. But I think there's a lot of opportunity. So for banks in particular, they really have been kind of the intermediaries, right? They were the bridge. If you wanted to borrow money or save money or invest money or move money, you had to come through them. And increasingly, they've been disintermediated. And the root of that word is intermediary. That was the role of the banks. They were a trusted third party between borrowers and depositors, and between parties around trade agreements and so on, and being able to be that trusted independent third party. But what's happened with financial services over the past decade is increasingly that third party is becoming invisible, or in some cases even gone. You look at the Starbucks app there, who knows what credit card that you put on file there, or at Amazon, or when you go to Disney, or wherever you want to think about this kind of embedded finance idea. If your bank didn't have, wasn't first in line, you used to talk about top of wallet. Well, it doesn't matter now. It's really who's on my phone and who's stored in my apps, because we're not going to the bank to get the financing. It's becoming a part of the experience. And if you want to skate to where the puck is going, as Wayne Gretzky liked to say, look at what's happening in Asia, where this embedded mobile commerce has really changed the whole face of the banking industry. Now, part of that is that the banking industry didn't have a lot to overcome, a lot of brick and mortar, pen and paper, face-to-face kind of infrastructure built up. And it'll be interesting to see how this global pandemic continues to grow. But so far, it appears to me that the economies that have been a little bit more decentralized and mobile, and those that are less reliant on those third parties, have been the ones that appear to be functioning the best so far. And I think there's a pretty good chance that will be the case going forward. Meanwhile, the industry prior to this current quarter had absolutely record industry profits in this country and beyond. The industry was doing very, very well. So they're getting the message of, hey, why do we need to innovate that much? Because what we're doing works just fine. And I love telling the story of BlackBerry, the company then known as Research in Motion. that was doing very, very well in the banking market. We bankers love that tactile keyboard, and we love the secure messaging capabilities and so on. And in 2007, you all know what happened to rock their world. The iPhone came out. And I usually pause the slide here to ask a room full of bankers, what do you think happened to their business? And most people conclude that it went downhill immediately, but it didn't. They had a record year and another one and another one and one after that. So imagine, I tell bankers this, but you imagine too, think about being on the board of Research in Motion, the BlackBerry company, and you keep hearing about this cool new thing, this new technology that's now available, the smartphone and the apps and the icons and the glass and so on. And it seems really cool and it's getting a lot of press, and I guess they're selling a lot, but it's not impacting us, right? We're having the best year we've ever had. In fact, even in 2012, when revenue started to slip a little bit, it was still the second best year they ever had. Well, you know how this movie ends. It continues to go down, and they're back down to about 2005 levels. The company hasn't gone under yet, but they're very, very niche focused right now. And it reminds me of a great line in Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. They asked a millionaire how he went broke. He said, two ways: gradually, then suddenly. And that's how disruption happens, gradually at first and then suddenly. And I think, as we think about what's happening right now with COVID, we went from gradually to suddenly. And another great Warren Buffett quote, only when the tide goes out do you discover who's been swimming naked. And we're seeing who's been investing in the kinds of technologies our customers want to see. So there's been over $100 billion invested in fintech companies over the past 5 years or so. I think that number is way outdated. It's probably a couple $100 billion by now. I haven't updated this slide in a while. And think about how that's been impacting. Have banks gone out of business? No, not really. In fact, most of the bigger banks have done better than ever. We already talked about how the industry had record profits. But just 10 years ago, a couple of college kids named Andrew Cortina and Ikram Magdon Ismail got together. They went to the University of Pennsylvania and they graduated. They didn't want to work for a large company. They wanted to be a startup founder like you. And they spent a long time trying to think about what kind of company would it be? What kind of problem would we solve? What could we do? And if I have the story right, I think it was Andrew that went to visit Ikram, and they spent a week sharing ideas and splitting Uber rides and pizza and beer and whatever. And when Andrew got home thousands of miles away, he said, well, I think as we tally this up, I owe you $120. How can I get that to you? He walked into a branch and probably heard things like, well, you can send a wire transfer. How much will that cost? Well, $35 and another $25 on his side. Well, that doesn't sound very good. Is there anything else? Well, there's ACH, but is it push or pull? Are you an authorized sender? You could write him a check, right? None of these things are really what they had in mind. And what really seals entrepreneurs' fate is they just won't handle the status quo. They believe that there's something better even if it doesn't exist already. So many times they go out and create it. You might have heard of this little company that they created called Venmo. And they were able to actually sell that company to Braintree, and that whole thing was bought up by PayPal back in 2013 now, and the company continues to grow. So they've done massive volume in peer-to-peer transfer, we call P2P now. That wasn't a category a few years ago. It wasn't something we even thought about. In 2017, what did the incumbents do? What was the answer from the banking industry, those rite of chasm people? Well, they came up with something of their own called Zelle. And so again, you ask, well, what did that do in terms of PayPal? Did that put them out of business? Because now the incumbents were striking back. The empire strikes back, right? Well, no, they continue to have record volume too. What's actually happened in this case is that the pie has gotten bigger. So Zelle has grown like crazy. Their volume actually dwarfs that of Venmo, although I think they're measuring it differently. But this whole notion, this capability of being able to send money from point A to point B without a whole lot of hassle with a couple of touches on a mobile phone, that's really taken root. So there's been lots of ways to make money there. But that investment in fintech companies, the Andrew and Ikram stories we're still relatively few and far between. What's really rocked the traditional banking world has been a couple of other things. The encroachment from adjacent players, so the Amazons and the Googles and the Facebooks of the world that are in the payment business. I think about Amazon. They've lent over $10 billion to small businesses now, and they have incredible insight on those businesses. They know exactly what's selling and what the inventory turns are. And then the digital arms race from within the industry. So the banks are investing internal teams. They're running incubators and accelerators for startup companies, and they're making acquisitions. And so the whole financial services landscape has changed dramatically, and I think it's going to continue to change. Went backwards, I want to go forward. So back in 2006, these were the 5 largest companies in the world. One was a tech company, and another one was a bank. 5 years later, it was a different tech company. We already know why. We talked about that. It was a different bank, this one from China. But what also happened in 2011 is that Marc Andreessen, the founder of Netscape, wrote an important op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal called Technology is Eating the World. Software is Eating the World. And that might have seemed a little hyperbolic at the time. Yep, software is everywhere, but is it really eating the world? Well, just 5 years later, these are the 5 largest companies in the world. They're all software companies, and they're all platforms. Platforms meaning that it's not just pushing out digitally products that they made internally, but they're bringing buyers and sellers together. So a new kind of intermediary. So it's not about having necessarily the capital and the assets, but are you able to bring people together, creators and consumers, in lots of different ways? So huge talk about GAFA, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple. But I think really with a global perspective, we need to think about GAFA-BAT and think about Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, which we haven't seen a lot of in this country, but we're going to see a lot more. They're actually doing volumes that make the GAFA-4 look pretty tiny when you look at the massive growing markets in Asia and some of the less developed parts of the world. Well, what does that mean to banks? So when I started in the banking industry in the late 1980s, we had about 13,000 banks in this country, and we've got about 7,000 today. We're going to continue to consolidate. But what drove that consolidation and what made banks successful was just executing a predominant business model better than anybody else. It was all about efficiency and execution, size and scale, and largely undifferentiated. Bank is a bank is a bank. And now I argue that we've been in this for a few years, and I think it's true now more than ever that we're in the era of agility. And so it's not just who gets the biggest and who's the most efficient at this, but who's actually faster at solving the customer problem and solving new customer problems in an efficient way and creating a better end-to-end customer experience, not just that face-to-face customer experience. Yes, I went into the branch and they were really nice to me and they might have even used my name. The customer expectations have risen dramatically and as the digital economy has come up. So with apologies to William Gibson, as he says about the future, I like to say about disruption, it's already here. It's just not widely distributed yet. And that's exactly where we are. And it's suddenly been widely distributed with the rise of COVID. So I find it interesting that we're having this conversation this week. This is the 50th anniversary of Apollo 13. And in fact, today is the 50th anniversary of the 3 astronauts returning safely to home. But we first heard these words 50 years ago this week. Houston, we've had a problem. And when Apollo 13 left the launch pad, it was one of the most ambitious, it was probably the most ambitious space mission ever. They really had massive plans for geology samples on the moon and a lot of other astrophysics questions that they wanted to try to answer through their research. And when that small explosion caused an oxygen leak, suddenly all of those big plans went away and the focus became much narrower. How do we get 3 astronauts back to Earth safely? And they had to do a lot of innovation and a lot of improvising. They actually ended up tearing off pieces of cardboard from their manuals and using literal duct tape. I'm glad to know that the Apollo astronauts actually had duct tape on board, and they were able to fashion a new container to hold the pieces that they need to be able to get enough oxygen to get 3 men back to earth. And I think this is a good lesson for where we are in time now. So those, and some of you may be thinking about this too. You might have some great innovative idea that you've been thinking about and working on for the last couple of years, but it didn't solve any kind of urgency problem for maybe not for customers or maybe not for any corporate partners. And so right now, figure out what is your urgency, what is that piece of oxygen that you've got to get to your users and get to your customers. Because most of the innovation that we've seen so far, frankly, in financial services has been at the experience level. What's touching the customer? So we've had improved branch experiences. We've added tablets in the hands of advisors. We've created better websites and better mobile sites. So the things that the customer touches, but in many cases, it's putting digital lipstick on what's really an analog pig underneath. We're still pretty early in the tactical stage. So the actual re-engineering of the processes underneath that, right? Taking a 4-page paper loan application and just digitizing it and then shrinking it and putting on a phone is not creating a digital experience. And we're really just at the early stages at that deeper strategic level. What kind of new business models, what kind of new revenue streams do we create by truly being digital? And this is where things like blockchain and distributed ledger technology, artificial intelligence, and other things can not just do the things that banks or provide the financial services that banks have provided for many, many years and decades and centuries, doing it a little bit differently, a little bit better. How do we actually reinvent all of that? So I think there's still plenty of opportunities out there. And part of that middle layer is APIs. And you probably have a lot of technical people in the audience here today understand application programming interfaces. And if you're out building a lot of digital tools in a lot of industries, it's really pretty easy because you can grab APIs from all kinds of companies and just create new ways of mashing up that data. But the problem is for the banking industry, most of the industry still looks like this. It looks like the back of our computers did in the 1980s. We don't have a lot of standards. Most of the banks haven't exposed the right pieces of data that you would really want to be able to create a better experience on the API layer. Now, not so true in Europe because of a new law that went into place last year called PSD2, the Payment Services Directive 2, because there was one before that, very creatively named. But this was really, not just a few things that happened over the last few years, but this is really a continuation of a 25-year timeline. If you go back to the early 90s, this is when banks first started to realize the capability of digitizing transactions. And what banks thought about at the time was, this is a great way to save money. We can, instead of taking the transaction data that we have and printing it out and putting it in paper and putting it in the mail and spending postage on it, we can digitize it all and we can encourage people to sign up for e-statements. But what happens with a lot of incumbents, and I think this is especially true of banks, is they don't think big enough, they don't think far enough, and they don't think deeply enough about what problems are the customers actually trying to solve. And so the Quickens and the Yodleys and others of the world said, well, wait a minute. If we can digitize this transaction data, we can do a lot with it. We can forecast it. We can report on it. We can categorize it. We can slice and dice it. And so things like Mint.com came out of this. 40 million users signed up for this to be able to put budgeting and categorization. And then in 2009, when the financial crisis really put the banks back on their heels, we had the rise of the first digital-only neobanks. Neobank meaning they provide banking services, but they're not a bank. Perk Street Financial is one of the first, and actually my co-founder and business partner, Jason Hendricks, was the co-founder of Perk Street. It was one of the first digital-only neobanks in the world. And now there's several of them. We call them challenger banks, and we are seeing them a lot in Europe and in Africa and in Asia. They're actually even replacing parts of the banking economy where we didn't even have solutions. And now where that's going now on the right part of this timeline is the banks are getting back into it, and they're starting to think of themselves more as marketplaces. And I could put a whole bunch of other logos up here, but these were some of the early movers of those that were wanting to open up APIs and partner with startups to provide better and different kinds of services. So at the end of the day, I mean, one of my core messages when I'm in front of groups of banks like this is say, look, you've got to get serious about innovation. And let's talk about what that means and what it doesn't mean. And what it doesn't mean is innovation theater. There's been a lot of banks that have opened up cool brick office buildings downtown, let people wear hoodies and sneakers and put in ping pong tables and beanbag chairs. That's not innovation. I love offices like that, and that can be conducive to creative thinking, but that's not innovation. Just saying, you know, we've got these different set of people. I give credit to my partner, Jason. He actually came up with this, but I love the phrase, the fintech petting zoo. And so what I tell bankers is, you know, going to, and every banker conference that you go to these days, or when we go back to banker conferences, they've got a whole room full of fintechs, and just, you know, connection with them, contact with fintechs, you know, doesn't make you innovative any more than going to a petting zoo makes you a farmer. But I'll tell you the flip side of it is, for you, is think about that too from your perspective. Hey, we met, you know, we went to this conference and we met with 40 banks. This is great. We're on to something. Maybe. Probably not. You got to really understand, again, what problem are they trying to solve and how can we help them with that? The definition that I like to give in class and with all the corporate clients that we work with is that innovation is about implementing new ideas that create value. Everybody gets the new ideas part. Everybody gets that, hey, we have this cool new idea and we mocked up something on a whiteboard. That's great, but that's not where the value is. You got to implement it, and it has to create value of some sort. Now, what that is really up to the end of the users. At the end of the day, it's up to the market. And so go back to the Apollo 13 lesson. So you might have thought you were going to add value around some new AI-driven customer experience, when right now they're trying to get oxygen in the space capsule because they've got customers that are trying to apply for the payroll protection program loans and they can't get them processed. And already, by the way, as of yesterday afternoon, it's too late, because all $349 billion of that funding is gone. Now, Congress is probably going to fund the second round, so we'll see how this goes. But the banks that didn't digitize their lending process, suddenly that became the more important piece of oxygen than you know, some cool user experience. So you've got to think about that. But at the end of the day, the banks are really stuck in the middle, where they feel this change, this pressure from the dynamic fintech landscape, but at the same time, they operate in a highly regulated environment. So that move fast and break things ethos that you hear from Facebook, and you might be hearing in, you know, your startup culture, that doesn't work inside a bank, and it doesn't work in a highly regulated environment. And so to bridge the gap, what the bankers really need is an empirical approach to value creation. So I'll share with you the way we teach bankers to innovate and to work with this, but I think it's useful for you to understand from your side of the equation. There have been what we like to call modern agile business methods that have been developed over the last couple of decades. Things like design thinking and lean startup and you know, user-centered design and you know, discovery methods and all different kinds of tools. Most of which, by the way, most bankers don't know anything about. They think this is actual rocket science when you bring up some of these things, but none of those things are necessarily magic bullets in and of themselves, and they have to be filtered through the needs of that highly regulated environment. So we thought about this a lot over the past decade, and we came up with a process of our own we call FIRE. And FIRE stands for fast, iterative, responsive experiments. Fast is about shortening the gap between ideas and results. Iterative meaning that it's not a one and done, yep, we innovated, now we're good. It's continuing to iterate that and making continuous improvement. Responsive meaning that those iterations should come from data. With a lack of data, what happens in a lot of large companies is the decisions made by what we like to call the hippo. That's the highest paid person's opinion. And the hippo is going to make a decision with data if they have data, hopefully, maybe. If not, they're going to go with their opinion. As Jim Barksdale liked to say when he was CEO of Netscape, he said, look, if we're going to go with data, let's go with data. If we're going to go with opinions, let's go with mine. And that's what will happen in a large of these companies. So the more data you can give them, the better decisions you can help them make. And then finally, the E is about experiment. So the whole idea of an experiment is it's structured to learn something. right? We got to test and learn. We got to try something new, do it quickly. You know the adage about fail fast. That freaks bankers out, by the way. We talk about fail fast. What they think is that you're just too naive to understand that, no, we're not going to fail at all. We're going to think and think and think and think about this and have some committees and some other meetings, and it definitely won't fail. That's where we point them back to that adoption curve. And if you wait till this thing becomes the gold standard that no one will see any risk in, you've missed the upside of the opportunity. You've given up the risk, but you've also given up the upside. So you've got to structure this for them in a way that where they can get value out of it. And I'm going to leave you with just a couple of closing thoughts here. This is, again, the advice that we give bankers, but I think you can find a little takeaway in it for yourselves as startup founders as well. One of the things we ask banks to do is really think about, well, what are you trying to accomplish? Are you just trying to extend the line, take your existing results and keep that going a little while longer? Well, that would lead you to maybe one set of options. And the tools and the frameworks and the strategies and tactics that you use today probably work pretty well to keep you going. Banks are really, really good at the core business of gathering deposits and making loans and keeping track of transactions. They do fine at that. But what if that isn't good enough? What if you want to bend the line and that 2 or 3% core growth, you want to be 8 or 10 or 12%? Well, then those tactics are less effective. And if you want to transcend the line and do something dramatically different, well, then they really don't work very well at all. And this is why you need a set of tools and tactics around innovation. The more you want to deviate from what has already proven to be successful for you, the more you need to innovate and think about this differently. And the Apple is such a great story. In 1997, when Steve Jobs returned to what was then known as the Apple Computer Company, they were an also ran computer manufacturer, 3% market share. Dell was eating the world at the time. And he said, look, we're doing too many things and we don't do them well enough. So he got out of peripherals and printers and a whole bunch of sideline businesses and focused on just 2 laptop and 3 desktop models. So that was the right strategy at the time. And that's the one bankers really like. They identify with that. Let's just stick to our knitting. But that wasn't the strategy that made Apple the most valuable company in the world, the first $1 trillion market cap company. And it's not the one that made Steve Jobs an absolute legend. They were able to transcend the line, not once, not twice, but 3 times, right? First with digital music, secondly with the iPhone, and third with the tablet. And so that was really all about setting your sights higher on something else. So banks aren't going to make those kind of moonshots every day. They're going to do it about, maybe once a decade if you're lucky. It was amazing that Apple did it, 3 times inside a decade. And frankly, most bankers are going to do something like that once in a lifetime. But I think we might be at that once in a lifetime movement right now with the global disruption that's happening with COVID. So with that, I'll leave you with one last thought here, and then I'm happy to take questions. But I'm often asked about the future and what do you see about this, or how's this going to pan out in the future? And the future looks like this, right? It's kind of foggy, and the further you try to look, the foggier it gets. But the secret is, not standing here and thinking harder about it, and worrying yourself because there might be a cliff somewhere down at the end of that path or a boulder that you have to avoid. The whole trick is, if you can make a few steps forward, you actually can see that many steps further down the road. And maybe there is a cliff off to the right, so you're going to have to bear left, but you won't figure it out standing here. And I'll leave you with a quote from the great Alan Kay. It says, the best way to predict the future is to create it. And that's what's great about startups, because that's really what you're out there doing. But if you're going to partner with more mature companies, whether they're banks or other kind of established incumbents, you got to also see the world from the way they see it, because they see a lot of risk. So with that, thanks. And I see there's one question already. So Caroline, if you've got others, send them. But a comment on Amazon providing dollars to small companies. Interested on a startup, how wisely consider this. Unfortunately, turn into R&D for the big company, maintain huge data. It's a huge risk. I'm not in any position to make a blanket statement on whether that risk is worth it to you or not. But when you think about partnering with a big company, so there's kind of a different slice, right? Partnering with a big company that's maybe not so stodgy, like an Amazon or Google or Facebook. But yeah, you've got a different set of risks there where are you helping them get better at some, if your goal is to eventually sell to that company, that might be fine, but you're still going to face that same sort of race is, can you reach scale faster than they can innovate? And so, I mean, at the end of the day, I think my most general advice is if you pick up a market that's small enough that you can really, really own, that makes it less likely that the big tech companies are going to come in and quash you on day one, and more likely that they might acquire you at some future date. So, I would not try to be a couple of things to a whole bunch of people, and you certainly can't be all things to all people. But I would try to really, really own a niche market and then think about leveraging those large companies for the value that they can bring. Question, being an outsider, how do you engage the right stakeholders in a bank or credit union and win their trust? How do you overcome their skepticism? I mean, it's a great question. I think the main thing is understanding their perspective and understanding their risk. At the end of the day, they're risk managers. And what I see when startups talk to banks and credit union, they talk all about the upside and they don't spend enough time talking about and thinking about and sometimes solving for what the risks are. Now, I'll also warn you that the other problem you'll run into is they tend to awfulize everything. Everything is a risk. And so if you kind of present this global view on, here's this amazing new future that we've envisioned, they're going to come up with about 157,000 risks that you haven't thought of. And so this is why fast, iterative, responsive experiments are so important. We say, yep, this is our great big grand vision, but what we want to do is run this little experiment right here. And in this little experiment here, we want to test this following concept with this following set of customers. And they're really about 4 or 5 risks here, not 157,000. And so here are the 4 or 5 risks that we think are the top ones. Here's how we'll address them. Here's how we'll mitigate them. Are we missing anything? Is there anything from your perspective? And so the more that you can show that you're understanding the mitigation of risk, the better off you'll be and the more progress you can make. Yep, hopefully you've got a good idea. You got the meeting because they think you're smart and you've got an interesting idea, but you won't get it off the ground unless you can help them manage risk. Next question, software engineer at UW, and I want to ask if anyone would be interested in working together on a project, if I can help anybody. So I'll let whoever's interested in that. I love the idea of working together. And by the way, I mentioned at the top of the call, one of the things that I'm spending most of my time on is the Alloy Labs Alliance. And what I love about the startup community is this idea of, hey, we can work together. None of us are as smart as all of us. And that was something else that took us a long time to really try to teach the banks to be able to share ideas. And not everything is a proprietary risk that you need to keep under lock and key. Most of you are working on the same kinds of things, and you can share knowledge and share labor and not, 5 people solving the same problem is one thing, but if you can split that up and have 5 different problems or aspects of the same problem, that can go a long way. Another question came up, having mitigated as much risk as possible, how likely would it be to obtain funding in these times? Well, what a good question. Being that even things like conversion notes are at 16% compared to 8% from last year. Yeah, listen, I'm not a VC funding expert, but I will share a few thoughts. When I left the banking world, still in the early stages of the recovery, I first started getting into this whole idea of innovation as a banker. In 2008, we had a meeting. Our CEO said there were a whole bunch of things that made our bank one of the strongest banks in the country. They're number 1 in return on assets, number 1 on return on equity, and number 1 on efficiency ratio. But our CEO said accurately, but we're not very innovative and we need to do all of the above. And so we had our first meeting, what we then called the Customer Council, because our focus on our innovation wasn't, let's go out and see what cool things are out there. It's how can we apply innovation to do a better job for our customers. And the day we met was the day that I think I always confused myself whether it was the Bear Stearns or the Lehman Brothers failure, but it was one of the big red letter days in the depths of the financial crisis. And our CEO said, look, we're not going to stop this. We need to be careful with how we spend our money, and we need to make sure we're focusing on the right ideas. But it's more important to innovate now than ever. And I think that's true today. And I also think that it was the depth of the financial crisis that led to the rise of fintech. And I think there will be plenty of opportunities here. Some funding is going to dry up, but there will always be funding for good ideas that are solving the right problems. And VC money wants to solve really big problems across really big markets. And for some, that might mean partnering with a larger company is even more important, because that's going to bring some things that you don't have. You might have a great idea, great technology, but if they've got a massive access to customers and an additional capital base, that might be helpful too. Follow-up question on trying to get banks to build some credibility with them. How do you convince them to create a window? I'm not 100% sure I know what you mean on that. Do you mean just how to get started with an idea? Because that is kind of hard. I'll come back to that if you want to shoot another note back. And another note, fintech and financial services in general is very expansive. Within the space, where do you see the greatest white space or upside opportunity worth exploring? Yes, it is very expansive, right? Fintech, financial technology, both worlds are big. You put them together, it's still awfully big. I will tell you that in the 2008 to 2012 period, a lot of, and this will go back to the fintech funding too, a lot of the ideas and a lot of the ideas that were getting funded was about, we're going to put your bank out of business, right? We're the Uber of banking and whatever. And most of those haven't really done. Even Venmo, which is a massive success story, didn't eliminate any banks from this. So the trend line had been over the past 5 years, those that help the banks get more digital. So that is a path. It's not the only path. Most of the innovation we've seen so far has been around payments and money movement. At the end of the day, most banks, particularly in this country, but all over the world, make the biggest chunk of their money from lending. It's the net interest margin between what they have to pay out on deposits and what they need to, what they can make back on the margin in the loan spread. And so there's really two pieces there that if you want to work in fintech and you want to help banks, they all need ideas on how can they improve funding, how can they gather more cheap deposits from all over, and how can they lend better and more efficiently. Probably the biggest structural problem in banks is their efficiency ratio, the cost of everything other than the cost of funds. Most banks are, I think today it's maybe somewhere around 65%. The top performing banks are closer to 50%. If you can take cost out of it for them, that's a really good way a good place to, I think, to play in. And then the last thing I'll say is I think we're in the super, super early stages around identity. And the more we can help understand identity, whether it's digital identity, whether that's distributed ledger or whatever, that has applications both for the fintech and the financial services world as well. Question is, Alloy Labs Alliance open for collaboration with fintech startups? Yes, but don't call us, we'll call you. And I say that both sincerely and a lot of jokes. Every startup I know says, well, boy, can you help us sell to banks? And we actually decided, we built this, talk about pickup market. We decided to solve the other side of this equation, is the banks aren't very good partners for you. They don't know how to work with you. And so we're really focused on them. We don't get paid by startups. We get paid by the banks. We kind of serve as their outboard innovation department. Everything we do is member driven and member led. And so if you go to alloylabs.com, and if you scroll down at the bottom, you'll see there's an application that's just for banks. But right above that, there's a link. If you've got a capability that you think is interesting and you'd like us to know about it, we've got a little database form where we'd love to hear that. We'll only let you know if that meets the needs of our customers, but we're definitely always on the lookout for fintechs that are doing cool things that can help banks. Back to the window question. So yes, by window, I mean being able to run a pilot or test. Yeah, banks are terrible at this. They don't understand the idea of test and learn. They want everything to be perfect. Hey, go perfect this. And once it's perfected, then come back to us and we'll sell it. And what we're really trying to work with them on is, what I said earlier, you've missed the opportunity if it's already been perfected. And so it's really, I'd go back to my original advice that it still applies. Help them understand how there's very limited risk and potential good upside, and really scale that test down to something small and meaningful. The upside is meaningful, but the risk and the lift on getting the test done is small. Similar question, culturally, how open are banks to running limited A/B type experiments to test waters for interest and adoption? Appreciate, by definition, doing so to be more public. Yeah. So no, I'm reading these, react to them in real time. So thanks for keeping them pretty to the point. A/B testing is another, like you're going to just sound like Steve Jobs if you come to them with this idea for most bankers. And I'm generalizing. A lot of banks have hired some really, really smart people who are used to doing this. But I'll give you one just super quick example. We had a bank that spent a long time launching a new digital lending. Yeah, well, actually, I have two examples. I'll give you the one around the mobile banking app. They had a very crappy first generation mobile banking app, and they launched a new, like, fourth generation, leaps and bounds beyond. They launched it, and nobody was adopting it. They had no idea. We said, well, they said, well, what do you think the problem is? We think this is really amazing. We said, well, how'd you talk to your customers about this? And they showed us, they said, well, we sent an email. We said, yeah, and, well, that's it. We sent an email. I said, okay, can we see the email? It was, I keep quoting my partner, Jason, because he comes up with some of these great lines. He said it was the ungodly love child between compliance and IT. The subject line was something sexy like important information about your ABC bank account. And then the body of the text was of the emails, a wall of text and a whole bunch of instructions, do this and click here. And so we actually introduced A/B testing to them and said, well, who are the customers you thought were most likely to adopt this? Well, it was the users of our other app before. Okay, well, let's test with them and let's A/B test this. So, I mean, at the end of the day, the questions you're asking are good ones. And I don't have a lot of silver bullets on, if you just say this magic word, or, here's one, one strange trick that will make banks do pilots with you. But it really is understanding their perspective. And I hope if I've given you any insights at all today, it's a little bit into the mind of the bankers. And yeah, and you as somebody said, I found it difficult in the past. It is. You're going to have to keep at it. I think it's getting better, and we're going to do our job to help make the bankers better partners. But we've got room for maybe one more question if there are any. And you certainly can reach out to me. I'm jp@alloylabs or .com, and I'm easy to find on social media if you want to reach out.
Maybe this is a good place to break.
I can take a breath and a drink.
Thank you. So, do we have one more? No.
Just a comment that, yeah, I've been overseas and wasn't sure if it's been more open here. The U.S. is opening and developing slowly and slower than a lot of the markets. So I'd love to hear where you were and what your experiences were there if you want to reach me offline. So, but thanks to everybody for, and Caroline, for you to invite me here. And I'm happy to be here. And I love UW, and I love CoMotion, and I love startups, and I love fintech. So I hope I will see all of you around. And most importantly, I love the Sounders. So I want soccer to come back again, and come find me in section 131.
Thank you so much, JP. I appreciate your time today and expertise, and thank you all for joining us for our Zoom edition of Fundamentals for Startups. I appreciate you all being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.